If, like me, you love horror films and books, you're going to love today's video. Well, maybe love isn't the right word. The man in today's story has influenced many cult classic horror films of our time, from Psycho to Silence of the Lambs to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. His name is Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. In Plainfield, the soil was dry and stony, meaning that farmers there had a difficult task ahead. However, this is where the Gein family moved to make a small living. They bought the property in 1914, 195 acres in the small populated area. They didn't really make an effort with the other people in that area, and instead chose to keep themselves to themselves. The family's matriarch was a domineering woman called Augusta Wilhelmina Gein. Her parents had immigrated from Germany in the 1870s to Wisconsin. She had a fanatical adherence to the Bible. She was a heavy-set, stern lady. At 19, her first contact with a man occurred. His name was George Gein. Now, George was an orphan. When he was only a toddler, there was a flash flood and both his parents and sister died. He was then raised by his grandparents who immigrated from Scotland. There was little love or affection in the home, but plenty of punishment. He left school really young to become a blacksmith's apprentice, which he hated. He soon developed a taste for alcohol after various job failures. At one job, he met a man called Fred, who introduced him to his cousin, Augusta. Now, Augusta believed that only her worldview mattered and what her religion told her. She was very judgmental. In contrast, George was very quiet, prone to bouts of depression, and like I said before, he was developing a drink problem. George liked Augusta. He liked that she had a big family, which he obviously lacked. They got married December 4th, 1899. The marriage was not happy. Even so, they were blessed with children, 2 boys. Henry was born in January 1902, and in 1906, Edward Theodore Gein came along. The fact that they managed to have 2 kids was quite a miracle in itself, because Augusta, when it came to sex, was disgusted by it. George was very work shy, instead preferring to just drink. He didn't have much time for the boys either, except to hit them with a belt. Augusta and George opened a little shop, but it was struggling. So Augusta announced to the family that they were packing up and buying a dairy farm in the country. George had no say in the matter. Within a year, she had sold that and acquired a bigger plot of land in Plainville. This is a lot of upheaval and uncertainty in the lives of children. It was very isolated, which Augusta preferred. She already thought the people nearby were of low morals anyway. Even so, the kids still had to go to school. Eddie, as he was known, loved to read, especially comics like Tales from the Crypt. He liked to read about cannibals and Nazi atrocities. School was an unhappy time. He was forbidden from having any friends, which had left Ed very alone in the world. He was quite a sensitive boy, and he cried when the kids made fun of him. He had a slight speech impediment and a droopy eye. If the boys did want to be friends with him, Augusta would shout at Eddie and say, "You're not allowed to speak to them no more." At home, his dad was lost in alcoholism and depression, and the farm struggled to yield enough for them to eat, never mind to sell. As the boys grew older, Augusta warned them of the evils of women and to avoid them at all cost. She told them the sin of masturbation was better than sex, highly inappropriate and poor boundaries. After a sad life, George died aged 66 in 1937. His wife and sons detested him and often told him they would be better off without him. His family's lives are said to have been made easier with the loss. In 1942, war was ripping through Europe, and Ed, aged 36, was called up for a medical. The draft board rejected him due to his eyesight, to Augusta's relief. He was working the farm and earned extra money doing odd jobs for people in the area. Another source of income for Ed was babysitting. The kid loved him too. He found it easier to talk to them than people his own age, and the parents seemed to like him too. He would tell the kids creepy, scary stories, which is ironic. But my dad used to have a friend, obviously not like Ed, but every time he come round, I'd sit in front of the fire on the floor, and him and my dad would be drinking, and his friend Robbie would tell loads of ghost stories from the local area. I loved it. So I can see why kids liked him in that sense. Now Ed's brother Henry, he found it easier to socialise. He didn't take everything his mother said was truth. He was planning on starting a life with a divorced woman who had 2 kids, and this caused an issue between the boys because Ed worshipped his mother. Henry died suddenly, aged 43. Him and Ed had been fighting a fire on the property. Now some say it started accidentally, some say the brothers did it to burn off dry grass and it got out of control. Either way, Ed lost sight of Henry and he grew so concerned that he got in the truck and drove to the nearest neighbour's house to get help. Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel gathered a search party. Ed told them to follow him when they got to the farm, and he led them straight to where Henry's body was, even though he'd said he'd spent an hour searching for him with no luck. He seemed to know exactly where he was. The area around his body was scorched, but Henry's body was not burnt at all. He just had a bruise on his head. The coroner, George Bladder, said the cause of death was asphyxiation. He said the head injury could have been from him hitting his head on a rock when he fell after being overcome with smoke, but no attempt was made to locate said rock. Henry Gein was buried next to his dad. Ed seemed unbothered by the loss of his brother when people offered him condolences, but a few months later, Augusta said she felt unwell. She had suffered a stroke. Ed was a doting son and was in the hospital as much as they allowed. He worshipped his mum. She soon was feeling better and was discharged. After a couple of months of improvement, on December 29th, 1945, she was rushed back into hospital and she died from a brain hemorrhage. Ed was just 39 and he was all alone in the world. He was noted to be sobbing his heart out at the funeral, utterly broken by this loss, and people kind of judged him for this, which is mad because, when you lose a parent, it is heartbreaking. You do cry. Slowly over time, he started to take odd jobs again to earn a living. His physical appearance, although not very good in the first place, had started to deteriorate. The farm had fallen into disrepair. Ed was described as a hard worker, reliable and trustworthy. Away from work, Ed had no life. People took great pity on him and would offer to deliver meals and cookies. The local men found him odd, and his conversations odd and bizarre. He would talk about the English body snatchers of the 19th century who sold them to medical research, which is something I am also interested in. The only thing Ed did was regular visits to Mary Hogan's tavern in the neighbouring town of Pine Grove. It was a 7-mile trip, and he was not much of a drinker. It seems Mary held many qualities as Mum held: abrasive woman, dubious in nature, although she swore like a trucker. Now, in Wisconsin during the late 40s, the police were baffled by some weird cases. In 1947, Georgia Weckler, aged 8, had disappeared after a neighbour had dropped her off near the home. She had half a mile to walk, but she never made it. 6 years later, Evelyn Hartley, aged 15, went missing. She had been babysitting. She usually called her parents every time she arrived at the home, but this one night the call never came. When they went to the house, the baby was unharmed, but there was a clear sign of a struggle and blood. Other than her bloody clothes, she was never found. The next to go missing was 2 deer hunters, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess. They vanished forever without a trace. The next was Mary Hogan. Her tavern left signs that something bad has happened. It was found unlocked, with a pool of blood behind the bar. Police found a .32 caliber shell, suggesting she had been shot. Robbery was ruled out as a motive. For 3 years, nobody knew what had become of her. They were soon to discover the truth. Ed Gein seemed fascinated by Mary Hogan's disappearance. He would tell people she was at his house, but people just laughed at him and ignored him, thinking he was just weird. There was talk that he had shrunken heads at his house, but people just assumed that they were Halloween decorations and nothing more. Bernice Warden's death would unravel the secret world of Ed. He had been asking her out for a while, and she had no interest in him whatsoever. She had a store in town, and Ed had been in for some antifreeze. She had wrote a receipt, and then he asked to see a gun. When she turned her back, he shot her in the head and dragged her away. Ed insisted to police he had nothing to do with her death. They asked how he knew she was dead. He said he must have heard it from someone. They held Ed in custody for robbery at the store. Now, the reason why they went to Ed is because of the receipt, because that was the last person who she'd sold anything to, in case that weren't clear. Sheriff Arthur Shilley had only been in position for a few weeks and gathered his men to go to Ed's house to search for Bernice. It was a dark, late night when they arrived. They used flashlights to see, as there was no electricity. Inside, the floor was littered with rubbish, mould, garbage, cobwebs, rodents. There was a sickening smell of damp and offal gone bad. Everywhere was filthy and chaotic. They could smell death. One officer seen a decapitated carcass suspended by its legs from the ceiling. This body had been gutted. It was Bernice Warden. That police officer ran outside and threw up. The men gathered themselves as they re-entered the house. There was an old coffee jar with chewed up chewing gum Ed had been saving. There was a bowl with old food in, but this turned out to be the top half of a skull. Some more skulls hung from the post of Ed's bed as decoration. A leather seat made of human flesh, the underside still lumpy with fat. He had 4 of these chairs. He had a belt made from human nipples. a shade pull made from lips. They found a whole skin suit consisting of leggings for his legs and the top of a woman with sagging breasts in tow. He had skinned one of his victims and tanned the hide, a skill his dad had taught him many years before. Ed enjoyed wearing it. The police then found a collection of women's vulvas, 9 in total, all dried. The latest had been sprinkled with salt to preserve it. There was a box of human noses, a death mask he had peeled from people's face. He had stuffed them to give them shape. He had 4 of these mounted on his wall, and sadly one was Mary Hogan. Behind a nailed shut door, the police found the room of his mum. He had kept it untouched as a shrine to her. He admitted to killing Bernice. He said it was an accident, so instead of calling the police for help, he dragged the body home, dismembered her, gutted her, and hung her from the ceiling instead. He said he also accidentally killed Mary Hogan with his rifle. He said all the other body parts came from graves he had robbed, not murders. He would follow the obituaries to get fresh corpses. Sometimes he would take a whole corpse, other times he would cut parts off in the cemetery. The police found this really hard to believe, so he gave them a list of all the graves that he'd taken things from, and one by one his version of events was confirmed. His defence was going with insanity, and he was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane for testing. He was found to be mentally incapable of a trial. He actually adapted well in there. He was cared for, he was clean, he had company. His belongings would be sold at an auction, and someone had burnt down the farmhouse one night. When Ed was told, he just said, "Oh, just as well." Ed's car, a Ford sedan, was sold for $760, which was exhibited as a girl car for years. People are sick. 10 years later, Ed was deemed well enough to stand trial for Bernice Warden. He didn't have a jury, so a judge decided just to keep him inside the hospital for life. Ed was happy there. He put some appeals in to leave from time to time, but he died in there on July 26, 1984, aged 78. He was senile and had cancer. He was buried in an unmarked grave next to his mum. Ed inspired decades of books and films and huge media interest. In his book Asylums, Irving Goffman discusses the institutional approach to the study of self. He discusses the response by which deviant subgroups are psychodynamically formed in society. I can't help but think that Ed was created by a warped, disturbed mother and then discarded by society. Even though we live in a more aware society of what isolation and grief can do to the human mind, I feel like he was let down and left to his own devices. People noticed he was struggling, but did little to help. There was also claims that Ed had sex with the dead bodies, but he claimed to have been a virgin. Judging by how he always listened to his mother, I can believe him. It's just a shame that women had to pay the price. The story of Gein is a disturbing one, but at the same time, I can't help but feel sorry for him. I know he did horrendous evil things, but I just think back to the little boy who, he was isolated. His dad beat him. I know loads of people get beat and don't turn into monsters, but he did. It's sad. And just to be straight. I'm not saying I feel sorry for the monster he became. I just feel sorry for the little boy he once was. I think two things can be true at once. And the description of his home life is really sad. It's just a devastating case. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.